Rich, thanks so much for taking the time to be here today. I'm going to just clinkety clank
Thanks for having me.
the coffee cups. And again, I sincerely appreciate your time out of your day and your work schedule. So, Rich Crowder, commercial and advertising photographer for the past 16 years, also a published author. You have a book that anybody and everybody who's going to the Virgin Islands and is considering climbing should definitely check out. It's called A Guide to Bouldering and Training and Traveling in the Virgin Islands. And I think that a island in particular called Virgin Gorda inspired the project to kind of come together. Mm-hmm. You have a degree in fine art photography from Arizona State University, and your ethos, which we'll dig into maybe a little bit later, which I really appreciate that you have a clear kind of understanding and vision for how you want to live in the world as a professional creative, is there is nothing more authentic and convincing than real people doing real things. And a lot of your work is around capturing and showcasing honest moments in a documentary style. Rich, very recently, just about 2 weeks to the day today, you had a pretty crazy near-death experience.
Yeah.
Do you want to give a little bit of background about that, or do you think that we should read anything that you wrote about that experience? It was really impactful when I read it. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts to share there?
Yeah, I've gotten some pretty amazing feedback, actually. And it was 2 weeks ago to the day, I guess last Tuesday. Yeah, I was up in the Bugaboos, which is a, world-class alpine climbing area, and just kind of had this unexpected freak accident. It was an area that we thought was pretty safe based on our, experience and knowledge of, decades of knowledge of rock climbing. And in the past, my buddy Eric was with me, and I was unroped, about to kind of get into this approach couloir, and we just put our harnesses on, but still unroped, and I stepped off a rock onto what I thought was maybe a foot of snow, but I thought I was going to give just a little bit since it didn't freeze overnight, and then all of a sudden I was gone, just falling, just kind of pinballing my way down. Yeah, there's definitely a more, I guess, there's a more detailed account on my Instagram that I posted last week, but bottom line is, I went all the way to the bottom, and there was a lot of water down there, kind of this like cementy slush, and I definitely thought I was dying. It was one of those situations where I think the vast majority of people that fall unroped into crevasses like that do die. And so, yeah, I've been just kind of like processing that whole situation. And luckily, my buddy Eric dropped a rope down to me and eventually got me out, and just totally saved my life. So it's interesting to have your best friend save your life, and you just kind of have this whole renewed view of life and what that means, and traveling in the mountains, and just kind of a wake-up call. But I've really been struggling with it because of the fact that I almost like wish we were doing something wrong. It's like, oh, we made this mistake, so this happened. But the reality of it was we just did everything right, and it was a little bit of bad luck. So I'm still here, got some broken ribs, so I'm trying not to laugh too much. No jokes today. But yeah, it's an interesting headspace to be in. I've never had that close of brush with death. I think another thing I commented on that resonated with people was like, a lot of people have a brush with death where it's like their life flashed before their eyes. And I feel like I had quite a bit of time where I was like ruminating on the idea of what do I do? Because when I was down there, I just, your first thing is like, okay, I'm going to get out of here. And then when you look around and you realize I'm not getting out of here by myself. That was when it kind of set in for me. And it's scary. It's a whole new level of scary. I think it's equivalent of before you have kids, you think love, and you're like, oh yeah, I know what that emotion is. And then you have kids, and somehow your heart gets bigger. You hear the story from everybody else kids. It's your heart gets bigger. You just find parts of you didn't even know could exist, and it's just like there's so much love to give to a child, and it's just like bursting through you. I think it was the same thing with fear. Like, I've been scared before, but it's kind of insane how scared I was down there, and it just like brought me to a whole new level. Maybe even like doing, some sort of psychedelic drug or something where people say you're on a whole nother level of like feeling. And that definitely, like, it definitely happened, and it's just like still at the forefront of my mind. I mean, it was like 2 weeks ago. So to be that scared was just like, it's just still like mind blowing. I don't even really know how to talk about it, but it's out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for, I guess, like being vulnerable enough to kind of to share exactly what happened, because anybody and everybody should definitely follow Rich on the social, like Instagram, at Rich Crowder, RichCrowder.
Crowder like chowder.
Crowder like chowder. But there you wrote a 3-part reflection about what happened, and yeah, it's really worthwhile to read if you're a mountaineer, if you're not a mountaineer, if you work in the creative world, if you don't work in the creative world, or I think it's just good for anyone to have perspective on that sort of experience. One thing I didn't mention, and you kind of alluded to it, is that you have 2 children, and you're happily married here in Portland, Oregon. So there's that family component, which makes things a lot more complex. With what you do for your work, what is your perspective on how to decide whether or not a job is worth taking when it involves something that requires you as the photographer or the filmmaker to go into a potentially dangerous scenario or in a dangerous environment, like a mountain up high, a mountaineering project, a climbing project? How do you decide on projects and whether or not they're worth doing or not?
I've never really thought about it. I think anything that's come my way, at least at this point, has been manageable. It's because I consider myself a traditional climber, more so than any other, like, sport and gym and bouldering and whatnot. And I think traditional climbing is all about mitigating risk. And like, one thing I tell people that don't know much about climbing at all is, like, we have these like little Dyneema strings that can hold like 24 kilonewtons. And, that's like, I don't know the math, but it's like 2 elephants or something like that. And well, it depends on how big the elephant is, I guess. But like the gear's there, and it's you're mostly, the danger comes from human error for the most part, and then obviously rock fall is a big unknown. But in general, from like the climbing aspect of it, I've rarely felt like I was like out of my element. There's definitely been times where, like, you look over and it's like, you just shake your head and you just fuck man, what are we doing? But in reality, it's just nerves, because it's all managed with the gear and like being at the right place at the right time, and just don't be in a couloir when it's too warm, and I don't have everything on you to manage the risk. So this accident in the mountains, that's what like really threw me out, was like it was just bad luck, man. And that's a bad feeling to have. So I don't know, some of the more dangerous stuff I've done, I feel like, is actually on like industrial sites that are like managed by very, very large corporations, and that stuff too. You're wearing like all these H2S monitors, and I was out in some fracking areas up in Wyoming, and the H2S monitor goes off, which essentially like is a bad gas, and you're supposed to just like walk upwind and away from it and stuff, and it just starts beeping, and like stuff like that scares me, because I don't know much about that. Or like early in my career, we were talking about this, what I, kind of where I got started is shooting out of helicopters. I was shooting out of helicopters like 3 or 4 days a week, and
Taking photos,
and it just started going beep, 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 all these red lights. It seemed like every red light possible was beeping, and then in your headset, it's like burr, burr, burr. And I just had no clue what was going on. I was like 20 years old. Like, then the pilot said essentially like the power steering went out, is kind of how he described it. And he's like, we need to land in the next 5 minutes or else like we're toast, So stuff like that scares the hell out of me, because I don't know anything about helicopters. I'm putting my life in somebody else's hands. But like in the mountains, most of the time, my life is in my own hands, or my partner and whoever I'm with. I trust fully.
Yeah. So to give a little bit of background for anybody who's kind of coming into the conversation unaware of Rich's like line of work, you do a lot of photography with people rock climbing, mountaineering, doing hardcore hiking. So you are oftentimes like up very high, like literally and figuratively. So up high in the mountains, like at high altitude. So maybe around snowfall. But also you are suspended on ropes oftentimes because you're up on a rock face. But you also do a bit of work in the energy sector. And so that brings you to a lot of environments where you were just mentioning you're encountering both, I think this is the correct term, but like subjective and objective risk, where there's risk that you can be like predominantly in control of. So I guess you being trained in how to rappel, knowing how to climb trad or off width or various types of like rock climbing, knowing how to traverse a glacier on a rope team, or if you're on multiple partner rope teams or single rope or by rocks, you have as much knowledge and preparation as possible. But then the other type of risk, which I don't know, maybe correct me if you think I'm misspeaking, but the subjective risk, which is the elements that are out of your control. So a rock fall, a snow avalanche could happen, something more environmental out of your control. So you're oftentimes doing work where both of those levels of like risk are pretty high. And that's kind of why I wanted to like bring it up. Like you are doing work where you are not only really skilled with regards to the type of photos that you're capturing, but also the skill sets required to get to the place where you take those photos or film. What kind of drew you to that, or how did you end up there?
Yeah, good question, man. So the climbing thing started early on. It was, I was a competitive swimmer at a very high level, swam through college and whatnot. And when that stopped, that was like 11 practices a week, and like just out of control training just takes up so much of your time. I lived across the street from a rock climbing gym, so that kind of just like segued into me falling in love with rock climbing. And I was a photographer who was like, okay, what am I going to shoot? And everyone says like, shoot what you're passionate about. So I was like, oh, I'm going to move to Boulder, Colorado, where my wife is from, and just like shoot with the, shoot for the mags, because all the mags are there and all like the companies are there, all the athletes are there. So that's kind of like where I went with the rock climbing. But in reality, that's not really what I do anymore. It's funny because it's like what I'm maybe most known for, because it has the biggest like social aspect of it. The majority of the work I'm doing nowadays, like I have NDAs on, so we can't even like talk about in like full details. In the past like 3 years, I've done like 90% like NDA work, and I think we actually met on the shoot for a company we can't talk about.
We can actually now. I read the NDA not too long ago. Rich and I met on a commercial project that I was directing for Under Armour, and we brought Rich on to do photography for. It's actually past, like literally, it said like a 3-year mark.
But yeah, you know how it is, where it's just like, doing that 4-letter shoe company, stuff like that. But yeah, so where I was going with that is essentially I kind of segued away from the outdoor industry. A lot of that was moving to Portland. When I was in Boulder, I was working with a company called Louder Than 11, who are doing some awesome work. Just definitely check them out, lt11.com, Louder Than 11 on Instagram, whatever. And they do adventure work, And I still love that, but moving to Portland, it wasn't a huge scene here, and it didn't really make sense to go with that. So I kind of took this smaller segment of my business, which was like construction, industrial stuff. I really started concentrating on that because I found that, there's a lot of photographers that get hired as like the portrait guy, or the guy who shoots football or soccer, or the guy who shoots, a certain millennial fashion type sector. But for me, I found I was getting hired because of my style of shooting. You know, this it's kind of this timeless yet modern, clean, minimalist style with a lot of negative space and, you know, authentic movement and, you know, natural lighting. And I thought about it and I was like, well, it really applies to this industrial space as well. And it's really because most photographers can't really handle being in like less than ideal conditions. You see it often like on Instagram, on social and whatnot, because it's that cool. It's like, oh, the guy's shooting in Antarctica or on like Everest or whatever. But in reality, there's a very, very, very small percentage of people that can like be out in the field and shoot multiple days, you know, that might be 16, 18-hour days shooting, essentially out of a backpack or two, and kind of being ready to capture everything in an editorial style, but on kind of an advertising concept and deadline and direction. And so that's where I've like taken my work now is, you know, can I be like all last week I was all over the Midwest shooting wind turbines for this very large undisclosed French company. But it's, you know, I was up at 3 a.m. driving 2 hours, shooting wind turbines being put up and with techs and like, you know, pretty dangerous construction sites. Like construction sites in general are dangerous, but when they're not just like your average, you know, commercial building going up, there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of big machinery, a lot of things happening. And to be able to like set up remote cameras or like climb a huge tower or like hang off of ropes even or anything, you know, like I'm just ready to go in any direction to get the shot on site, on location, like whether it's, you know, I've shot in the middle of nowhere, Colombia, and our fixer that was with us, who was Colombian, he was like, oh my God, we're in the middle of nowhere. Like he was surprised how remote we were, you know, or like middle of nowhere, China or something. I can just get on a plane, fight the jet lag, and then shoot a 16-hour day back to back to back and then fly in a plane back. And that's kind of why I get hired more so than like, I'm just the guy that does industrial photography. Because a lot of guys, they need everything perfect all the time. And like, especially studio shooters, you like throw them outside and they're like, you know, oh, the light's not good. It's like, sometimes I like shooting in the middle of the day because everyone's like, oh, the light sucks in the middle of the day. I'm like, why does it suck? You know, it's just different. It's just different. Like use that really, really harsh light from straight overhead that like most people are scared of. And it's like, can you create some sort of shadows? Like, can you push your camera gear to us, you know, to really highlight the dynamic range and like make something different. So I'm always just trying to make something different, but not in like such an avant-garde style where I'm like completely out there. I just have like my finger on the pulse of what the industry needs. And I'm like, how can I skim around it and add my style to like what's going on right now? Because you never want to be shooting like what's going on. Like if you look at what's being published right now, you don't try to copy that if you're not already doing it. Because like by the time you master that, there's already people that have mastered that. By the time you master it, it's like long gone. So it's like just keep doing what you're doing. But for me, it's just, you know, it's more about the place and how I shoot it than like the actual subject of the imagery.
It's really interesting to hear how like you were working in the like more predominantly in like the outdoor space where your commercial work, like as you mentioned with Ladder 11, was more adventure oriented. So doing a lot of the expedition style like photo shoots, the big rock climbing expeditions, the big climbs and stuff like that. And then you transferred a lot of those skill sets with how you were just mentioning that sometimes for this energy work that you do, you're having to climb ropes, be comfortable being up high, being in unfavorable conditions. And you utilize still a lot of those same skill sets.
Totally. I even have this I have this whiteboard up in my office similar to here. And at one point, like a couple of years ago, I was like, I'm going to list things that I'm good at, you know, because it's like, I'm always trying to concentrate on like what I'm good at. I don't want to go too broad, you know, what am I good at? And number one thing on the top is adaptation. And I feel like that's probably my biggest strength in life is I have this fascination with like knowing a little bit about a lot of things. Like I'm not really an expert in anything. Like maybe you could argue photography, I guess, but like I just love knowing little random facts about every single culture and industry and sector that you could think about. And I think it's this like lifelong obsession with learning, which is, I think, why I'm a photographer, because I love going places and you just meeting people that are completely different from you. I think it's why people fall in love with traveling as well. And it's like, as a photographer, you don't just meet those people and like experience them for a second. You really have to address who they are, where they are, what they're doing, and try to package that into like a photograph or a set of photographs that really tell a story, and then factor in like a brand or like a, creative deck that, 30 people at the advertising agency spent 6 weeks on, and just mesh that all together and try to create like the most honest, like authentic story of that moment and that like action. And I just learned so much when I do that.
And to you, with your style of a little bit more of a documentary, editorial sort of approach, where you're capturing like real human beings doing these like real types of work, do you know what drew you to doing that style of photography as opposed to when people oftentimes think of commercial, where they're hiring models, they're hiring talent to come in and portray someone, like why you decided to go a little bit more focused onto the documentary style and working with real humans in that sense?
I mean, I still work with models all the time, because that's how the industry works in general. I'm always drawn to projects. I did a series of advertising campaigns for Gore-Tex a couple of years ago now. And what was really awesome about that to me was they wanted to find real like experts in the field, right? But it was actually challenging because they had to be non-sponsored athletes, but also like have a certain level of clout within the industry. And so that was cool because you just feel like you're dealing with like the people who would be maybe the most picky of like an ad campaign. So you're like, how can we show this? Like, is this a trail that you would really run on? Like, is this like a climbing area? Like, even so, we shot one that was climbing, and it was like, they literally were like, you can go anywhere in the world and shoot anybody you want. Like, what do you want to do? And to me, I was like, well, I wasn't living in Colorado anymore. I was like, well, I really know this area in Colorado, El Dorado, and El Dorado Canyon is like, as authentic as it gets. Like, if you're a rock climber, like, El Dorado Canyon, and it scares the hell out of you because it's like finicky gear, and it's just got so much history behind it. Like, all these badasses in the 60s were putting up these amazingly, terrifying and modern routes. And so for me, I was like, well, let's shoot that, and then let's shoot a guy who's known in that community, Chris Widener, and he's written guidebooks and around the area, not to El Dorado, but around the area. And if you're a rock climber in Colorado or probably like anywhere, you know his name, but he's not just some Instagram spray lord either. So finding little stories like that, even though it really wasn't about him in that story, to me, like, to have those undertones where if someone did look at it and like, oh, this is a Gore-Tex ad in like Travel and Leisure magazine or whatever, it's like, oh, damn, that's Chris Widener. Like, he's legit. Oh, that's El Dorado Canyon on like a 5-star route there. That's legit. Versus just finding like a pretty spot that like fit the structure for the layout, which is fine too. Like, that's how it works. Sometimes you get like creative directors come to you and you're like, here's a comp. Like, we need it like 2/3 over on this side. Here's how big the person's like head needs to be. It needs to be smiling. It needs to be backlit over here. It needs to drop out to some negative space under here. Blah blah blah. Create an image exactly like that. Essentially, they pull from like stock libraries and whatnot, and that's fine. You just have to do that. And I enjoy shooting, so I'll do that kind of stuff. But for me, it's like, if we can create something that's real, I don't know, it just has more power. Even though it's like, obviously fake. Like, I went up there and with the Gore-Tex thing, I was like, I went up there for like an advertising photo shoot with my buddy John assisting me, and like we posed down these shots essentially. I mean, he really climbed it, but I don't know, it just adds something else to me.
So it's like the stories that you tell, they're like scary to hear, especially if I was thinking from like the perspective of like your wife or your parents or like a brother or sister. I don't know if you have brothers or sisters, but like hearing like, oh, like Rich is climbing a giant turbine to take a photo, or he's climbing like some crazy rock face in Colorado. Like that sounds so dangerous. I don't want Rich doing that. But now if I put myself into the shoes of someone who's an aspiring professional photographer. Not too long ago, I met an awesome, amazing photographer and also super talented climber. Shout out to Caleb Jacobson. He's like a climber at the circuit, just
Okay.
like a teenager, right? He's like 17 or 18 years old or something, just graduated high school, and his mountaineering photography is top notch. And he came to me after like I took some photos of him at a bouldering competition, and was like, "Hey, I really love what you're doing with Story Firm. That's my video production company. I'd love to talk to you. I want to potentially pursue a career in photography in like the mountaineering space." And so it's like if I'm a Caleb or somebody who wants to become a professional photographer and I love outdoor adventure, all I want to do is be rich and be up in the mountains shooting these ads for Gore-Tex. When you started doing that sort of photography, when you were first doing the adventure climbing campaigns, this was probably a little bit earlier in the days of like Instagram. What would your advice be to those aspiring photographers who want to pursue professional photography in that adventure space
Yeah.
or adventure industry?
I think maybe the most important part is everything kind of starts with the athletes in the outdoor adventure space. Obviously, there's jobs and stuff that come, or through brands and whatnot. But if you have no clout and you don't really know what you're doing, and you don't know anybody, you need to be hooked in with the athletes, because then it's like the athletes lead to their sponsors, and their sponsors are the people that are like buying the photos. Magazines, it used to be more of like trying to get into the magazines and making submissions and whatnot. I don't know how important that is anymore. And as much as I love magazines, it's like, it's kind of the quality is getting lower and lower. They're just trying to get like more and more budget photos. So I wouldn't say the best photography is in magazines anymore.
Where do you see the best photography?
Probably Instagram, really. I think it's hard because there's so much photography on Instagram that it's hard to find like the best. And I think a lot of people that are actually making the best work don't even really care about Instagram, which is always disappointing. I might fall into that pattern as well of like people that are actually doing work and getting too busy to like spend the time on Instagram, I think are maybe making the best work. And then there's the whole other level that it's like they're so busy that they have like a staff, and then they have a really good Instagram because they have staff doing it. So it's tough.
So is that what drew you to moving to Colorado? Like you knew you wanted, well, you had your
This
now
is
wife,
pre-Instagram,
yeah. But in the sense that you wanted to go to a place where you could be around the athletes who are doing some of the best mountaineering
Totally.
in the world.
Because that segues
Colorado.
into like the other most important point is just it's networking. I always like joke with people. It's like I'm a networker who takes photos, and just doing your like homework and knowing, not sounding like a Gumby and not sounding inauthentic, not like trying to get something out of people all the time, but like really investing yourself into people's stories and like who they are. Some of the people I've shot with that are like more notable professional athletes actually end up becoming like really close friends that you want to keep seeing, not just on a professional level but on a personal level. So I think just building relationships is key. And then obviously you don't even have to be that good at photography, I think, to have a successful career.
Sorry, I just
thought
touched
that was your dog.
Yeah, I touched Rich's foot with my foot.
And yeah, so I actually don't think you need to be that good at photography to have a successful career. I think you need to be at a certain level, though. And for me, I can't really speak as like an art buyer or creative director of any sort, but for me, I see people on Instagram all the time where I'm like, they don't even know, like they're just pushing their blacks, and like they don't really know anything about technical photography. They grew up in like the filter generation. Oh, we got a lawnmower.
We have some landscaping happening outside.
Actually,
of the
it's
filter
funny.
generation.
It's funny. I was working on this. I guess I can talk about it. It's already out. I was working for this kind of consulting on a shoot for a vape company, and which was interesting. But the influencer that we were shooting, she mentioned she was like watching me do some post production on my computer, and she's like, "What? You correct every photo like individually? Like what filters are you using?" And I was like, I've never used a filter in my whole life. I don't know. I start from scratch. Every photo is different. So why would you ever put a filter on something unless it's made for that photo exactly? You know, in my mind, it like just blew my mind that people are just like, this filter looks good. But it's like, well, somebody created that filter for, I don't know. And obviously you can change filters and whatnot, you know, and it's fine. But I just think this like VSCO filter generation of photography kind of got out of control. And like, no disrespect, there's obviously like amazing photographers that are like well within that little VSCO niche, but for me it's just not my thing, you know. I'm more like I have hopefully a more timeless style to my photography where like the colors are true and I know the actions are authentic and the framing is unique.
And so you actually know how to develop a photo? Like that's something that you've done? And for anybody who doesn't know what I'm actually saying, like a lot of photography was done on actual cameras that used physical film that you would buy and put into the camera and then have to take out of the camera and then take those negatives and then turn them into printed images. And that's something that you know how to do?
Totally. Yeah. No.
I know I'm saying it.
I know it sounds crazy now, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't think I'm
I've
that
never done
old,
that.
but
yeah.
I think I'm towards the end of the film era. I haven't shot film in forever. Commercially, actually, I've never shot film, and but
As opposed
all
to
through
digital,
college and
which
all
is
through
what
high
it is.
school, yeah, I was. I mean, I had a digital camera towards the end, but it was all film. I was shooting 4x5 film, large format, view camera stuff. Mm-hmm. And, developing in a darkroom, color, slide, black and white, everything, yeah. And I think that obviously isn't needed nowadays to be a photographer, but it gives you so much more of a foundation for understanding, like, the 10 zones of black and white photography. Like,
what are those? Yeah, because I read that actually in one of your posts.
It's essentially just, I don't know who came up with it.
It's
You
like
can
a
research it.
gradient?
I mean, Ansel Adams kind of made it famous. Yeah, it's the gradient of black to white and trying to have, you know, all of them in a photograph. So it's just, I don't know, people nowadays, they just put like a black and white filter and it's like, oh, black and white is black and white, but that's not true at all. Like you want the gradients and you want the tones to like really sing together in a way, you know, and that was just all done like dodging and burning, like, oh, the sky's a little hot, like, oh, and most people like don't have, do you know what I'm talking about? In the darkroom, you'd have like,
I mean, I've known about like darkrooms, and I'm sorry to say, like when you said dodge and burn, I was actually thinking to Photoshop, which, you know, the dodge and burn tool.
same concept, yeah. But it used to just be like, you'd cut out like cardboard a lot of times, or like something with even like a more feathered edge, and you'd cut out like weird shapes, like circles and like long strips, and you'd put them on like coat hangers even, and you sit there and so it doesn't create a hard edge. And if you're doing like, I don't know, a 45-second exposure on the enlarger, dodge and burn in various areas. I mean, you can see like notes on like Richard Avedon's portraits, or like extremely complex notes on how he wanted his printers to print them out. And so I kind of fell in love with that process through a mentor of mine, Mark Klett, who's just a genius landscape, large format photographer, you know, in the MoMA and Legion of Honor, like very highly successful in multiple books. He kind of took me under his wing through college, and I actually did some master's program under him as well. I didn't get my master's degree, but watching him print was like watching like a conductor of a symphony, and just creating this like massive, massive print of like a saguaro cactus. He's known for like southwestern landscape, and that really got me into trying to be a fine artist as well. I was trying to, like, in college, I was taking 4x5 pinholes of like 3-day exposure of me like building some sculpture in the middle of the desert by myself or something, and that was all definitely influenced by Mark Klett. I mean, I think you just take your mentor's work, and even my commercial work now, I mean, so heavily influenced by Chris Shin, who I assisted for many years, and his vision and his way of like waiting on stuff to happen, and like, kind of whacking things out of focus, shooting through things, shooting through leaves, and creating shapes, and eyeing like tangents in the background. So I'm always looking at the lines, like where does this horizon intersect with this tree, with this person's eyes or whatever, and I'm just constantly adjusting like millimeter by millimeter when I'm shooting.
And
I learned all that from Christian for sure.
And so it's like these influences and those photographers and the styles and approaches that they had. I'm just taking like a wild guess, and you can kind of fill me in. But these photographers were doing a lot of their work, and I don't know what they're doing now, but were they taking images on, I don't know if analog is the correct like distinction between analog cameras, so cameras that use real film, versus digital, where you're putting in some sort of memory card, an SD card, a CFast card, or a CF card.
Yeah.
So were these mentors of yours more coming in from analog photography?
Totally. Yeah, they're both known for their analog work more than their film.
And do they
more than
still?
digital. I mean, they both still shoot, and they both shoot digital at this point too. But Chris, I don't know if Mark shoots digital, but Chris certainly does. Yeah, he's a working commercial photographer out of Denver. Yeah.
One of the little bits of like conversation that we had right before we started was, I guess, like identifying a motivation behind the photography as far as a career path. Like when you think about that, or when people come up to you, and again, like the same sort of like younger up and coming photographers who are wanting to make a career out of photography, is there a mindset that you have around how you want to exist as, like you had mentioned it, as like a working photographer? Like what is your thinking there? Like,
yeah.
To make photography a career.
I think I've always just wanted to be like a working class, like middle class photographer. And we were talking about this, where I think the separation of, we're losing the middle class in America, like in general. And I think that mimics what's happening in the photography industry as well, where there used to be a lot more just like medium, large size companies doing, consistent work for good rates. Not just like crazy like Coke or Nike money or something, but just like, living wage, single family, pay your mortgage, have a decent lifestyle. Now it seems to be trending more towards that, like cheap, can I get it for free off of Instagram hashtag types campaigns. And then there's still like definitely very lucrative advertising campaigns out there. But like, you kind of seen the majority of editorial photography go away. Like there's very few people I think that can make a middle class living shooting strictly editorial.
And when you say editorial, just to clarify that, is that for people who are like shooting for like a New
magazines
York Times?
And newspapers? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, those rates, like you even see like artist reps dropping that work altogether, because it's those percentages aren't even worth it to them. So they're just going after getting their photographers who they represent the higher end ad work, as opposed to the maybe more consistent but smaller rate editorial jobs.
An editorial and like journalist.
Yeah, I mean, there's
style.
Definitely like
there's a distinction, right?
It's a broad thing, right? But generally, editorial is referred to as magazines and newspapers, and now obviously there's a huge online segment to that as well. Mm-hmm. Travel photography maybe was within that. But to me, it's like photography is separated into consumer photography, which is what most people like when you like are at a dinner party, you're like, oh, I'm a photographer. Oh, my brother shoots weddings or whatever. You know, nothing against weddings, but there's like direct to consumer, which is weddings, senior portraits, like pregnancy shots or whatever. And then there's editorial, which is like newspapers and magazines. Then there's commercial photography, which is like this broad swatch of like working for companies and brands, creating collateral, essentially everything from like website collateral to annual reports and sales meeting stuff and all that. And then there's like the traditional advertising as well, which is kind of within commercial, where it's like you're creating specific images for specific advertising campaigns for brands.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I exist in that commercial realm.
Mm-hmm. But with a style that's influenced more from like an editorial approach in a way.
Yeah, because that's like naturally what I do best. You know, I have no problem like posing people, but I just feel like it just never feels as good to me. It's not like the artwork that I want to create. And when I find myself the most happy about it, like I even had this joke with my buddy John, was like when I got the shot, I started like clapping, you know, it's like happy clappy. And it's like I genuinely get like really, really stoked when I'm creating something that I think is worthwhile. And that's what keeps, you know, it's like a drug. It keeps me coming back to like create better imagery. And I get that more with the editorial documentary style. I don't want to say I'm a documentary photographer because that's unfair to like people working for the New York Times or people working, you know, war photographers and stuff where they don't insert themselves at all. I'm fully inserting myself into the scene and fully directing the scene, but as little as possible. And I think brands, the past 5 years especially, have really glommed onto that because people have a harder time relating to, I think, have a harder time relating to like really glossy, perfect imagery, if that makes sense. Like traditional advertising photography where it's like, you know, lit with 7 lights and there's like 30 people on set and it's just like this exact thing that they were going for that's like really glossed out, really technically done in an amazing way, but where I like the technical aspect of my photography isn't necessarily in that vein, but more in the like, can I follow this person, you know, wide open like f2.8, like a 24 mil, and like just have them actually like run this little circle, and like can I keep that focus and also get a frame that like has this perfect line in the background that leads to like the logo of the shirt that like we're shooting for or something, you know. So for me, it's like trying to pull on all these strings at once and almost getting lucky. Like I'll take like 300 shots of that same exact thing just to try to get that one perfect one where like her, you know, the body positioning just creates a story. Like her gaze creates a story, or him or whatever. And the action creates a story, and just have all those little strings come together. That's more relatable, I think, because those people are doing it naturally versus somebody who's trying to pose something unnatural and then make it look as natural as possible, if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me because I've been in scenarios where a few years ago I was working on a commercial video project for, I'll just say, yeah, it was for Gibson guitars, but we were actually working on a headphone that they were releasing at the time.
Okay.
For a really fast Olympic champion, like the fastest person in the world ever, who had a headphone line. And he wasn't in the campaign, but the company that I was working on behalf of had a creative director who sold the project to the advertising company who was working for the headphones. So just to give a little bit of perspective to people, like that's sometimes how these campaigns work. You have the product, there's an agency, and then there's like a production company. So I was working for the production company, and the creative director at the production company thought people would be really into seeing imagery of someone rock climbing with full ear covered headphones, which doesn't really happen. And it created actually like a dangerous scenario for the woman who was climbing, and then the headphones came off and like just smashed, exploded upon landing. So it was a very inauthentic scene that was created by someone who didn't really understand climbing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so actually I was going to inquire about that because like that's that's, I think, what also, of course, like makes you really unique in these instances where you're working with athletes, you're working in these environments where you have to be like really physically fit. The project that you were just on like 2 weeks ago, where like as you mentioned, like you had that really crazy near death experience, it ended up kind of becoming a little bit more of a project that you were there for commercial like purposes. But with regards to like keeping yourself physically in shape and like capable, like where do you prioritize that? And is that, do you think like something that motivates you to do this sort of work because you have to stay in like really good shape? Yeah.
Totally.
Because you're
I've
also
had
filming
multiple.
surfing, you're filming like
Yeah.
skiing, every adventure
I mean, that's part of my
action
pitch,
sport.
right? Is
Yeah.
like, yeah, I've shot like
Because you
some of
ski,
the
you
some of the
surf,
most
you mountaineer.
hardcore, like pipeline on the North Shore. Being in the water on the North Shore is gnarly, first of all, when it's going off, and then it's way more gnarly with a huge camera that you're like toting along and trying to use, and you're essentially in the worst spot possible for existing, but for photography it's the best spot. So you have to like, my head's always on a swivel. So like I can shoot on the North Shore of Hawaii with pro surfers. I can go to the middle of nowhere Colombia and like discover new climbing routes and new caves that no one's ever been in. I can barely, I almost died then too. But I'm very adaptable, right? And I can relate that back to like, I do a lot of work in the oil and gas industry, and my personal beliefs and political beliefs generally aren't that parallel with some of the people I'm working with, and even in that sense, like I can kind of even like pull an accent. Like if I'm in like West Texas, it's like I don't talk the same as if I'm in Portland, and you just notice the type of stuff that they're saying, and you try to mimic their behavior in order for them to feel comfortable. And so I think it's like that all the way to like surfers on the North Shore to like rock climbers doing whatever. It's like as long as you're good at observing and then adapting, I think that's like my strong suit is. And it comes back from like that obsession of like knowing a little bit about a lot of things. You just do your research and you adapt, I guess.
Yeah. Like the reason that question came to my mind was because when I was going through your Instagram, like I saw the photo that you had of Gabriel Medina, who's like a really super well-known surfer. And so you kind of like brushed by exactly like what you were doing and where the risk factor was. So you're in the ocean in the North Shore of Hawaii where some of the biggest waves in the world are surfed, and you're in there with, when you say like large camera, like it is something that is of course like a large camera, but it's also inside a water sealed enclosure. And I've used a water sealed enclosure for a camera before, and what people don't understand also is that when you're normally taking a picture, like you're of course like putting the camera up close to your eyes so you can see the viewfinder or the screen, and you're just clicking away, and that's how you are also then reviewing the photos. When you're in the water with a camera, that camera, because it's in a large water enclosure, is also creating a larger surface area that then gets pushed by the water. So imagine having a giant plastic or steel box that then gets smashed towards your face as you're holding it by your face. And not to mention that you're also, like the picture I was looking at, when you're in the water, you're capturing a photo of a surfer as he's in a wave where he's catching a barrel. So the water is above him, almost completely like encasing him inside the wave. So you also have someone with a fiberglass surfboard
Yeah.
with really
Razor
sharp
sharp fins.
underneath
Totally.
the board coming towards you.
Yeah.
And yes, you might capture that photo, but what happens right after that photo is something that you don't see, which is like you're oftentimes then the object in the water that's getting thrown down towards maybe some reef
Yeah.
or really unpleasant, like near drowning experience, which
Yeah.
unfortunately happens with surf photographers. You see a lot of them actually wearing helmets, bright yellow helmets now.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's the sort of stuff that you do as well, which is like really crazy and
Yeah,
admirable.
definitely like to get a barrel shot, especially like that. Yeah, you're like on the edge, man. Like if you're just a little bit too late pulling out, one, you can get hit, but then two, like yeah, you can get sucked over the falls. And I mean, especially some of those waves are breaking in 2 feet with coral reef right below it. So
How did that
yeah,
project come about? Yeah.
I was out there shooting some other stuff for Patagonia actually. Yeah.
And had you done surf photography before?
I grew up surfing, and I grew up in the ocean and a competitive swimmer all the way through college. So I'm very, very comfortable in the water. Using the camera though in that housing it's still like I don't do it every day, so it's still like a huge handicap. But it's something that again, like I just try to adapt to different surroundings and specialize in being able to do that kind of stuff.
And were you using fins?
What? Yeah, definitely have fins. One thing that's interesting, though, that kind of segues to what we were talking about before is I can relate to the underwater housing in the same way on an industrial site sometimes, right? So I was over in Antwerp recently, out in some very large industrial complexes, and you have to have like double hearing protection, so like earplugs plus the big like over ears. Then you have to have like full on, I have my glasses on, but then a full on mask over that. Then hard hat, you're in coveralls, so like head to toe, you're in fire resistant gear. Steel toed boots, which, shout out to Keen Utility, best boots around.
Portland, Oregon company.
And yeah, and, a lot of times you have to have gloves on. It's almost like shooting underwater. Like I think about when I'm in those situations, I'm like, not every photographer can do this, because when I hope all photographers, but at least good photographers, the camera is this extension of their body, at least for me it is, when it's almost like a watchmaker, like using like tiny little tools with a magnifying glass. That's kind of how I feel when I have my camera on my hands, is like I can touch everything. I know every little millimeter of that camera, right? And I'll even like change exposure, like when I'm walking around, just like off of like that changed 2 stops, and I'll like swirl the back dial, and so it's just really this extension of your body. And then when you throw all of that gear on top of it, it's essentially like cutting off your hands, but you still have to like do the watch repair under the microscope, and I like that challenge, I like, and that's where like the technical aspect of my photography comes in, because a lot of people look at my work and they're like, oh, it's 95% like natural light, which generally is considered quote unquote easier maybe than like putting up 7 different lights and like sculpting the light. I like to think of myself as almost like a light hunter, where I'm looking for these perfect slices of light and how they fall and how the shadows fall on people's shoulders and hair and eyes and whatnot. Versus like sculpting the light. I just find it. But it creates this handicap, which most people would be like daunted by. But for me, it's like I'm psyched on that. I'm like, oh, this is a really, really hard place to shoot. Like maybe it's a really low light and like I got to deal with all these X factors. For me, it's like that's where I excel. Because it's easy if you're in somewhere that's like really bright and beautiful light, and like they're models, they know what to do on camera, they, everything's like perfectly picked out. It's fun because you can get beautiful photography that way. And sometimes my photography is not the most beautiful photography, but I think it's very interesting photography. And I'm always looking for situations that like have never been captured before, but more of like, okay, how come this hasn't been done in the past? Maybe because camera's capabilities, like they weren't up to par with like high ISO. So I'm like, what's like the darkest situation? And that's like comes into a lot of industrial stuff too, right? You're in like a manufacturing plant, and the only imagery you've ever seen of a manufacturing plant is like when they stopped everything, put up some lights, and they had a guy like pose perfectly as he's like screwing on the top to some like industrial piece of machinery or something. And it's like, that's how that was for decades. But now with, high ISO capabilities, I can shoot at like 6400 and hand hold a stabilized lens at like a 60th of a second. I'm creating something that's like never been created before. I think, in general, at least like it's something you don't see every day. So yeah, trying, like, I look at what everybody else is doing and I'm like, how can I make something different? And I think that's actually going back to what you said, like, what's the best advice for somebody starting out? Is like, just try to do something a little bit different. There's no reason you should be like copying what everybody else is doing. Like, it really blows my mind when somebody finds something on Instagram and might like save it and they're like, oh, I really want to go to this like bend in the river that's like geotagged on Instagram because it's beautiful and I want to make that shot. But a lot of people think that way. They're like, oh, I saw this shot that I want to go copy. And that's like just never been part of my repertoire. I'm like, wait, what? That's already been shot. When what are you doing? So
I like that advice. I like that advice a lot. I have a friend who's he does a lot of landscape photography and then some architectural photography as well. And he has a little podcast where he shared also his qualms against geotagging. And I think that was kind of oriented around it as well, where he didn't feel that everybody needed the exact coordinates as easily. And I think there's something to that too, where you have to go through a little bit of trouble to sometimes get to a place.
I mean, I had a client actually suggest that, because I was kind of doing the location scouting and where I was doing essentially all the production for the shoot. And their only request was like hit the most geotag spots in the areas that I was shooting. And it was because the lead imagery was for social, and because they wanted to be able to, like, we shot up at like Rowena Crest up in the gorge, which is like the most Instagram spot in the gorge.
The place
it's a big
with
horseshoe road.
Yeah.
And you can like
Everybody
dangle
shoots it
your
from
feet off
above.
the edge right above it. And, I did it because it's a job, right? It's like somebody else, I'm not always in control of what I'm doing because I'm a commercial photographer. I'm not a fine art photographer. I'm a commercial photographer who's essentially a gun for hire sometimes, And, they were just like, shoot the most popular spots, but with our product in it.
Cool. Nothing wrong with that as long as it gets attention
that's
to the
like,
product.
that's a tactic for sure. And now they're going to get more likes on that. And then the more likes, could translate into sales maybe. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Brand recognition.
Yeah, because that was actually like, in your Instagram, you have really thoughtful captions, which I appreciate, where you
Thank you.
give your perspective behind not just what the photo is about, but like why. And I loved when you wrote, when oftentimes like you're working on a project where if somebody's kind of assigned to work with you to bring you to a more sensitive area where you'd need to be, wearing any sort of protective equipment, and they'll tell you, oh, Rich, like, this is where I bring every photographer to get the best sunset shots. Like, what you oftentimes will ask is like, can we go somewhere else now?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like,
It happens.
Is that your rationale?
Oh my God,
as
it
well?
happens all the time. Yeah, because generally it's I think you're referring to like on some big industrial site, and they're like, oh yeah, we had a photographer from wherever, like some other shoot or some other company or something. Like, we had a photographer here. I always take everyone to the 7th floor. That's the best spot for sunset. And I just shake my head every time, and I'm like, I appreciate people like thinking about it for me, but for me, it's like, I need to find something that's mine. And that's why people are hiring me, I hope. I mean, sometimes it's like a job that it's not the greatest, and I'm literally just a hired tool as part of the whole production. But in general, I consider myself being hired for my brain and the way I think and the way I see. So I'm like, well, don't tell me how I see, like, I don't know. Nothing to look down on them, but like they're like a worker, and for me it's like I'm a creative, and to be paid to be creative, it's kind of like a weird thing actually, because I don't really even consider myself that creative. But there's a lot of pressure on you, right? Because like if you're if you're getting paid for like production, I think this happens a lot in video production where there's a lot more people on set that are paid for like a technical skill, where it's like you're a grip and you understand how to run this certain
sound recorder,
audio guy or whatever. And like definitely there's an art to audio, like 100%. But in general, you know what I'm saying? It's like they're more hired as like a technical aspect. But for me, I would like to think I'm getting hired as like this creative, like maybe mastermind. I don't consider myself a mastermind, but like obviously, you know, I've been vetted by the agency who's hiring me, and like it's not all about like the numbers, it's about like vision. And so there's an obligation, I think, to like have a vision that's distinct, and there's an obligation to like make that vision cutting edge in my mind. So yeah, it's just funny when people suggest things, because it's not my style. It's not my style to shoot something that somebody's already shot.
And for the work that you've been doing and continue to do with the clients that you work with, like how do you think about it when you're asked or when you're needing to figure out like where your next client comes from? Like how do you make your photography business work?
Oh man, I wish you could tell me that. It always just seems to work out. It's a roller coaster. I also want, like, I'm glad you asked this, because I feel like whenever you see like photographers on podcasts or like spraying on Instagram about this and that, it feels like this like fake world where everything's like hunky dory. And I've been blessed and like super lucky to like constantly have clients since I started. Like I've just really just worked out every year. I'm like, oh, you know, my business has grown and like I'm getting better clients, and just keeps going up, which is great. But that doesn't mean like I don't have these like crazy roller coaster rides down, you know, like people think I'm out shooting all the time in like the most exotic locations all around the world. But it's like the reality of it is I'm mostly hunkered down in my home office, like in my PJs on my like 10th cup of coffee, just grinding, man, just grinding. I mean, it's constant outreach, right? Because I for sure have repeat clients, but there's so much movement within the creative industry, especially in agency worlds. So like, you know, people are gone every 6 months, and you're like, oh, you were my best contact at that client or brand or whatever. And it's like, now that person's gone doing something totally different, which definitely works out for like maybe getting hired onto that new brand too. But I spend a lot of time like on LinkedIn and just like going on these deep cycles of researching who's out there, who's making what work, you know, and just trying to keep up with trends, and then making my best guess of like, what's my best step forward as far as outreach. You know, I'm doing like mailer promos, like actual mailer promos out to people.
Yeah, so you print out
email promos constantly just trying to stay, you know, on the forefront of everyone's mind. And, you know, I use like a CRM software, client relations management software, that like tracks everything, man. From like
Salesforce small business, or
essentially Salesforce, but different, what's it called? I forget what it's called, because it's just a plugin on my Gmail. But, you know, everyone's like color coded of like, haven't reached out to yet, want to reach out to, like reached out to, but they haven't emailed me back, reached out to, they expressed some interest, reached out to, and they expressed a lot of interest, like ongoing conversation, like possible client. Everyone's like like thousands of people are broken down into those. And so, you know, I just prioritize them. Be like, oh, all of these people have said something like, oh, we love your work, we'd love to work with you in the future, but we don't have anything that fits right now. Then I know those people are like, oh, I gotta make sure I send them promos all the time. So like that's like the majority of my life, right? And like just doing that, and then pre-production and post-production, it's like I'm actually not shooting that often. Definitely not as much as like, you know, people would guess.
No, I think it's really valuable for people to understand not only how much work goes into developing relationships and maintaining relationships, but how important it is to be reaching out proactively and yeah, being a good person.
Yeah. I think a lot of artists, photographers fall into the same vein as what happens in the music industry a lot. You see amazing musicians that will never ever make it because they're just way too obsessed with the art and playing music. And they're like, man, I just want to play. I just want to rip my guitar. I just want to like get my band together and just rip it. Like just make music, write. And that's great and all, but that's most of the time, unless you're like some crazy savant or like really, really lucky, that's not the bands that succeed, right? And I think it's the same with photography. The people that are like really visually inspired, like you definitely need that visual inspiration to like wanting to make work all the time, and making work all the time is important, but it's a business. Like first and foremost, it's a business. And I think that's a big thing that goes wrong nowadays is so many people are obsessed with getting their work out there that they don't really know. I mean, I think it's because of Instagram, really. And they're just like, I'm just going to Instagram all the time, get more followers. And then things will like cascade. But there's a lot of failing photographers that you wouldn't know that they're failing. Or not, I mean, failing is kind of a harsh word, but like people that aren't making a living doing it, that 99% of people that are following them would think they are. You know, there's so many photographers out there that are like have a spouse that's like a doctor and that makes good money, and they make not good money, but they're creating work all the time, and you know, they're getting some exposure out there, and you know, have a lot of followers and stuff. And that's just, I mean, that's never been for me, and that's like definitely a path that people can take, but I don't think it's healthy for young photographers to see. Just like I don't think a lot of social media is healthy. Like it's just this constant like trying to keep up with the Joneses type thing. And in the photography industry, it's just exacerbated, I think. People really, 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 really want to be photographers. So they'll like do anything to call themselves that, yeah. But I think if you have a mindset that you're a business, that's the foundation that you need, is always think of yourself as a business. Treat yourself as a business, like get a CPA, get a lawyer, have very specific contracts, estimating software. Like you have to set everything up like if you were, you know, a donut shop or whatever. You can't just be an artist. Some people get away with it, but I think if you're just an artist, it's not realistic to have the expectation to succeed as an actual commercial photographer.
And was that your understanding coming into the career path, that like you were thinking about photography as a way to kind of sustain your family, sustain yourself, and have something that you do for your work that aligns with your interests, but having it be a work that sustains you? Is that kind of like the working photographer mentality?
Yeah. I mean, well, at first it was all about like the work, and it still is about the work. It's a huge part, but I don't think I could really do much else. I've always said this to people, where it's like I have such an obsession with looking and evaluating shadows and gradients and tangents and color, and like I always say it to my wife, it's like sometimes dangerous for me to drive in like a beautiful canyon or something, because I'm so inspired by the light. And I think I've been given that gift of like being able to see in a certain way that it's almost like my obligation to keep making photographs. So, and then it just kind of makes sense to do it as a living, because you're like, well, you might as well just do what you're good at and what you love. And, yeah, so it's a balance. It's a balance, but I've always kind of had a business mindset. I've always like tried to like charge more than the average person. You know, I even said this to my, one of my assistants. She's up in Alaska right now, not assisting me. It's really frustrating. And
that's what happens when you find somebody who's a good assistant, right?
Well, she's up there fishing in Alaska, so it's like probably a once in a lifetime experience. But she had an opportunity for a gig recently and called me, and she was like asking me about pricing. You know, she's kind of newer in the industry, and you know, a big client. How do I not sound like I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want to charge too much. I don't want to charge, but I want to get the money I deserve. Blah blah blah. And I said, like, think about it this way: if you if you're charging double what like somebody else might charge, yeah, you might lose every other job, but you're getting paid the same amount of money as somebody who's half your price for doing half the work. And that's always been my mentality, is like I've tried to just keep rates high, because I don't like, there's guys out there with low rates and they're getting tons of work and they're working all the time and they're perfecting their craft. So that definitely is like one way to go. But I also think it's like not healthy for the industry to shoot like no joke, I'm not gonna say what client, but like there's clients who you would think are multi, maybe even $1 billion international apparel companies that are hiring people for like $1,000 a day, like complete buyout of all imagery for like ad campaigns, like all collateral, everything. And there's people that are literally like out there giving up everything to do that. And that doesn't even cover like my overhead of being a business, right? So it's like charge way more than you think, because in reality, like actually the PPA, Professional Photographers of America, they have like a cost of doing business calculator.
And
it's like
updated every year.
It's super eye-opening, because you're like, oh yeah, damn, it does cost me a lot of money to stay in business every year, even though like I have a home office and like, I have my overhead's pretty minimal. And I actually listened to like maybe a podcast interview with Michael Clark. He's like a old time. He's very relevant still,
filmmaker?
But yeah, he's known for like his adventure work.
He was a
big partnership with like Adobe, and I don't know. I listened to some podcasts, and he had something that really resonated with me about. He's like, keep your overhead low, and just like the way he said it, you could tell he was like learned from experience. Like maybe his studio got too big at one point, or I don't know. I don't know the story. I don't know him personally. But it really resonated. It's like, there's a lot of people like, oh, we have a ton of success right now. Like I've been shooting it. I made an F ton of money, because in photography you really can. But then on the other hand, the second you make a ton of money, the next year, the next 6 months from you can make like almost nothing, right? So it's like, don't go out and buy all new gear and open a studio with all this overhead and like hire a full-time assistant and this and that, because you just never know what's coming next. It's not always like a straight up trajectory, I think, for successful careers. It's almost everybody I've ever talked to, and who's being honest about it, they talk about how it's like super high, super low, super high, super low, super high, super low. So you just hope you have more highs than lows, I guess. And I've been lucky enough to have more highs than lows. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the orientation of keeping overheads low. The experiences that I've had as like a professional like filmmaker, like I worked for a very short time like as a freelancer, and then I got hired by a production company for about 2 years, and I saw how they had a couple really good jobs that then motivated them to open up a big studio. At one point the team was over 20 people, which was like a lot of people. There was a lot of staff to manage, and the cost of having the studio plus payroll, it was just too much. After I left, a couple people left before me, and then I left, and then a few more people left, but then the team scaled down to, at one point, I think it was maybe 5 people. And that's kind of like where they've stayed now. They do a lot of, I think, educational work as well, like education for other filmmakers, but like in terms of full-time staff members, it's not more than a couple. And I've seen it happen to other production companies, and even within advertising agencies, you oftentimes see if a big client comes in, the agency will swell sometimes 20-30% in terms of people working there. But
for
then if
one
that
client,
but then if that client leaves, which happens because clients sometimes want the creative direction from a new fresh agency, then the team can scale down. So I think that's really good advice also for aspiring photographers and filmmakers. The rental costs are so low for equipment, and especially if it's equipment that gets used periodically. I oftentimes recommend people renting equipment or buying secondhand from a reputable
borrow
source.
lenses is like pretty affordable.
Yeah, borrow lenses,
borrowlenses.com,
lens rentals. Yeah. I might have to hit up
Not
Lens
sponsored.
Rentals about trying to get them to sponsor the show. I give lens rentals a fair amount of business, and then buying used equipment is I think also really a smart way to go. It's just like a car. Once you
Yeah.
take it out of the parking lot, it drops in resale value 10-20% easily. And try to make it something that you're going to be using often too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I,
having cameras collect dust is not a fun thing.
I can definitely comment on the gear thing too. I get that question all the time. Like, oh, what camera should I buy? I want to be a photographer, this and that. And then first of all, I'm like, do you know how to use your iPhone? Because the iPhone's a pretty damn good camera, and most people don't know how to like change the exposure on it and whatnot. But and then second, it's like, yeah, don't be afraid to buy the used gear, because it's like people think of, even so I shoot most of my stuff I shoot with 5Ds. I've always shot with 5Ds, 1, 2, 3s, and 4
It's a
now.
Canon camera.
The Canon camera, and yeah, people like look down on the 3s because the 4, at this point the 3s are maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I just like, it blows my mind because somebody wants the newest and is going to pay double for it when they don't have like any money or any clients coming in. And it's like, well, the 3s, like people shot like Coke ads and people shot like the most high-end photography in the world on those cameras, like not that long ago. You know what I'm saying? Like, or even the iPhone, for example, right? The iPhone now is probably a better camera. I know like it's hard to relate the exact stats because it's an iPhone versus like a digital SLR, but it's probably better than the cameras that they were shooting the biggest ad campaigns on, or the average ad campaigns on, in like 2006, right? Those 10x cameras now are like legit, or Google Pixels or whatever the nicest cameras are on the phones. It's like, those are legit cameras. Why not just use that instead of buying this like $6,000 setup just because you read some blog post on it, or in your favorite, million follower Instagrammer has a sponsorship of that camera, so you think you have to have that camera in order to make those images. And it's like, I mean, the best photographers can make really good photos with any camera in any scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone can make a good photo now.
You have
Anybody.
to know the tool, though. You have to know the tool and maximize it.
Yeah.
Maximize the tools that you have. Like it's interesting to see it, because in video production it's the exact same thing, where people are always craving for the latest
Red.
Yeah, biggest pixels. I mean, I have a red here, but I bought it secondhand and it works fantastic. It's now like a 5-year-old model, but it still like holds up really well.
5 years ago, people were like, "Oh my god, this is insane!" But now
Yeah.
you're like, "Ooh, 5 years old.
Doesn't shoot 6K, doesn't shoot 5K. You know?
Okay.
Yeah.
What's really changed? Nothing. We're still just watching it on our iPhone. So
The bits of takeaway that I want kind of like aspiring photographers, but also anybody who's interested in the creative arts to take away. I love what you said about a response to someone who asked you a question in one of your images about it was actually a photo of a surfer in the barrel at North Shore. It's like, man, Rich, how do I get your job? And you responded, foster a talent with your camera, work harder than the next guy, demand professionalism, have thick skin, and get lucky. Would you say that that's still a basic formula for like the advice that you'd have for somebody looking to do this as a professional art?
totally. Yeah, what was it again? That's pretty insightful.
Let's just read it one more time because it is great. Foster a talent with your camera, work harder than the next guy, demand professionalism, have thick skin, and get lucky.
Yeah. I feel like, to address them one by one, I mean, you have to have talent. There's a lot of photographers who are like, you see it a lot with like the middle-aged person that like switches careers and they're like, no, I'm going to be a photographer. I've always wanted to be a photographer. And that's really great and that, aspirational. But the reality of it is like, there's a lot of bad photographers out there, which like, just have somebody give you critiques, it's like I was bad. I was definitely bad at one point, but it's like, you have to have a certain amount of talent and just find what you're good at when it comes to shooting. Like, at what point did you decide you were a good enough photographer to try it? Pick what that is and foster that in any way possible, And then, what was the next thing?
Work harder than the next person.
Yeah, there's a million people trying to be photographers out there. A million. So literally, I mean, I don't know what I average per week, but I work way too much. I even say sometimes I work 24 hours a day, because often I'll get up in the middle of the night and I'll write stuff down, or like immediately when I wake up I check my email, because I'm dealing with clients from all over the world, and you have to be willing to work literally 24/7. I might have some ulcers because of it, but it's the lifestyle I've chosen. But it's definitely not easy, and I think that's like the number one thing that people should know is, like, if you want to work hard with no entitlement your whole life, like, because there's no retirement package, there's no like when you hit 50 or whatever you're gonna like just be there. I mean, there's plenty of photographers in their 50s where like 50 to 60 is their worst years possible, but the vast majority of professions, right, like 50 to 60 years old is probably when you're making your most money. So just be ready to work your ass off constantly.
And then the demand professionalism, where
Professionalism,
does that kind of fit in?
I mean, that's a little bit what we've touched on, is like there's so many people out there that almost consider it a hobby, and then they want to like make a little bit of money here on the side doing it, this and that. And so they're willing to like shoot for really cheap rates and like just cut corners because a client asks. And in reality, it's like demand what you need to uphold a certain level of professionalism that's in your business plan, essentially. What kind of photographer are you? Are you a high-end photographer? Or are you a low-end photographer? Whatever you want to choose, then decide what you need to do that, as far as like money and production help and like communication and everything, and you just need to demand it. And it's kind of like a scary thing to do, because as a freelance worker, you're always like easily cut almost, and you like want to foster good relationships and be nice and respectful to everybody. But often photographers kind of like get walked on, like we just get walked all over because we're like the freelance creative help versus like somebody who's in the agency. So I think if you have clients that maybe have the tendency to do that, you just show them how professional you are with like contracts, right? It's like, no, I need my contract signed before we start this shoot. This isn't like an option. Because often they just, take it casually. And if you show that you're not demanding that professionalism, your work will never be taken as like a high-end piece of artwork,
Mm-hmm. And then the have thick skin, is that oriented around just the criticism?
Lots of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what's it like? There's studies out there of like click rates and whatnot, but it's like, I think a successful open rate for kind of just a regular old email promo campaign is like 2% or something.
Yeah, single digits.
Single digits for sure. And obviously it depends on how targeted your list is and stuff. But if I send out like 1,000 emails to people, it's like, I mean, if I get, like 12 clicks or something, that's like a huge win. So you can't really think of it as like all those people that didn't click or didn't open and just like deleted it. And you're like, but it's so important. I really want to work for you. Or like, my work is perfect for like your brand. And like, I think literally like my dream client, and then your dream client like doesn't answer your emails like 7 times in a row. It's just like, people are busy. And you just have to take rejection constantly.
Then the people that you're oftentimes, like you as the photographer, are working with, are they the creative directors at like advertising agencies, or sometimes they're the creative directors at a brand?
It's different. Yeah, I kind of do like half agency, half in-house from like the brand. Yeah, it could be anyone from like a marketing manager to a creative director to an art director to a photo buyer or an art producer, integrated producer. I mean, like, yeah. It just depends on how every team and every brand and agency does it differently, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then the last piece of advice that you had was get lucky. Is there any lucky breaks that you remember for yourself, or serendipitous moments?
Oh, lucky breaks.
I think that
I've never really had that moment where I'm like, damn, that just came out of nowhere. Yeah, I think everything I've had in my career has come from like being diligent, being professional, like constantly just going after it. I didn't have that like huge phone call that changed my life or anything.
Do you think
Not
it's
yet.
do you ever think about like some of the work that you've done and laugh at the ways that like unique skill sets that you happen to be fostering over let's say a lifetime in the swimming pool then transferred to you like surfing or being in like some really heavy surf in Hawaii actually like linked up
Yeah.
the fact that you
It's
loved rock
well,
climbing
that's what I push. So like, it's not that big of a surprise.
mm-hmm.
But I think I did this shoot for Adidas, and we are shooting with like some Olympians, some Olympic swimmers, and I grew up as a swimmer, and my parents like owned swim teams and swim camps, and I moved to California actually to swim when I was 14, and to pursue the Olympics, which never happened. And it was interesting because like I think a lot of these Olympians that they're sponsored athletes, and they were kind of expecting like just Joe Schmo like photographer to come in, and I hopped in with like a Speedo and like my goggles, and like they were like, whoa, you're like a real swimmer. And like I knew some people that they knew, and like I raced with Michael Phelps a bit when I was a kid, and even through college actually we were the same age, and just like dropping names and like, oh yeah, this was my coach, or this is like this team that I swam for, blah blah blah. And that definitely makes you feel good of like it's just another level of like connection that makes you feel like, wow, I'm doing this for a job. Like I love photography, and I actually don't like swimming at all anymore, but it was kind of burnt out, but it was nice to see that like I felt comfortable in that zone, and I felt comfortable with those people, and like I knew how to portray it in an authentic way. And it definitely gave me like a little smile to my face, like, oh shit, this is going down. Like I'm not like all my life's hard work and like all the different things that I've like gotten into, they do like come back around and pay off at some point. Yeah.
So never underestimate the things that you're doing that you maybe love at that moment and then not know how they might relate to what you do with them later in life.
Yeah. I mean, just constantly, like, the key, I think, is just be a sponge, man. Just, like, any sort of knowledge that people have, whether you, like, believe it or not, it's, like, just soak it in. And you can learn something from anybody, anywhere, right? Like, I always tell a story about, like, I was shooting in this maximum security prison in Wyoming. And it was, like, these guys doing an electrical like right before it was done. So there's no inmates or anything, it was like a construction project, but it was like 99% done. And I just remember like walking through the kitchen, and there was these two huge industrial sized donut makers. And we were with like it wasn't the warden, but like a representative from the prison of some sort, I was like, what, how many people are in this prison? And it wasn't that many, right? It was like, I don't know, 300 or something. I'm like, why do you need so many donuts for one little prison, like that's not even, it's hopefully not gonna be full, because it was like super max, and maybe it's just maximum, I don't know, it was hardcore. And it just opened my eyes, because he was like, oh, donuts are like a thing in prison, like donuts are like the thing people really look forward to, where it's like donuts this morning. And it just allowed me to put myself in the position of like somebody who's maybe on death row, and not necessarily to like sympathize with like criminals, but just that like they're humans, and they have this like, oh shit, it's donuts this morning, it's Tuesday. Like that's the same kind of feeling that like everybody has about something. And it just like took me out of my place, because like in these maximum security prisons, the one thing I noticed was like there's no soft edges. It felt like it was all like metal concrete, like hard edges. And I'm like, damn, these people are going through a lot living in here. And like most of them probably deserve it. But yeah, it's just interesting to like find those little connections where it's like, well, I'm on a photo shoot for like an electrical company, like, but I learned that little bit about humanity. And those pieces, man, they just keep me coming back to like I'll shoot like anything, because you can learn something about somebody, no matter if you're like in Singapore or in Belgium or in Colombia or in Iowa. It's like everybody's got a story to tell. Like, why not listen? Because what else are you doing?
I really like that I like that perspective and appreciation of the opportunities and places and people that you get a chance to meet through your work. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful takeaway and probably a nice way to put a ribbon on this conversation. But I wanted to ask if there's any other messages that you wanted to kind of share with humanity or with people who are aspiring to live a maybe a more creative life. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think about it a lot. I have two little kids. I have almost 5-year-old and an almost 2-year-old. So it's definitely something that's like always on my mind of like how do you want to raise them? How do you want to push them? Because you're kind of like ultimately you're like sculpting these humans, right? You want to let them like live free and find their own path, but in reality, like as a parent, you're really sculpting them, and I think one of those like so stereotypical things to say is, just like find something you're passionate about and really take a broad approach and chip away at like how to exactly get to that place. I think a lot of times people can like jump towards a passion, but really just kind of evaluate like all possibilities within a passion, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't want to get like too specific on like how to become a photographer, but yeah, just don't get lost in it. Don't get like beaten down by it, and try to stay positive and know that the end goal is to like be happy in life, I guess. And so just constantly like evaluating like how can I make myself more happy in the work that I'm doing. Because it kind of peeves me when people are like, oh, it's Monday. Or like, hell yeah, it's Friday, weekend. I'm like, is that really a way to live your life? I mean, I know that's like, in general, that's almost everybody. But it seems crazy to me. And I hope my kids don't think that way, where they have to do something. Because you don't have to do anything. So it's like, pick something you want to do. And it's like, you should always, I mean, work's work. Like still, like sometimes it's like, oh, damn, I got a little work to do. But in reality, it's like, I'm pretty lucky that I'm not like living weekend to weekend. So I guess like if there's one point to take away, it's like, just try to get away from living weekend to weekend, because that's rough, man. And I know I'm a privileged person that was like, a privileged and very lucky person to not have to live weekend to weekend. But I think some people could try harder to not live weekend to weekend.
There are other options.
There are other options. Not for everybody, not everyone's as privileged as middle class white male like myself, but there should be options for everybody. Mm-hmm. It's 2019, I hope.
Yeah, we're living in the I think I heard the term, I've heard it a while back, but I heard it recently again, like the gig economy, where through what opportunities exist with the access to the internet, it's really changed the way that a lot of people exist, and what it is that people do to sustain themselves, and the mm-hmm. opportunities that people have, and how the playing field has changed.
Yeah,
not just leveled, but changed.
Creativity is king. That's like something I really live by. Is like it's easy to get when it comes to photography or arts in general, creative endeavors. It's like it's easy to get lost in this, like, oh, he's doing that, or I'm doing this, or I don't have enough of this gear, or I don't have enough of these resources, or blah blah blah. But I think, from what I've seen working with like some of the biggest, best ad agencies in the world, and like some of the biggest, most creative, amazing brands out there, it's like the one thread through all of it is like creativity is king, man. Like if you have a good idea, it will, and you make that work, it should work out. Because I don't know. I mean, that's all that matters in the end, is like how creative is the idea.
I love it.
Yeah.
Mr. Rich Crowder, thank you so much for taking the time to share so much useful life experience that you've had, and advice that you've taken and distilled from it. I'm really happy again that considering the circumstances that you were just in 2 weeks ago, you've come away relatively unscathed.
Happy to be alive. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Lots of appreciation for that. For people who want to see more of what you do and learn more about what you do, what's the best way to find you, to reach you?
Kind of everything's just Rich Crowder. So richcrowder.com, rich@richcrowder.com is my email if you want to hit me up. Instagram, Rich Crowder. Twitter that I never use, Rich Crowder.
Awesome.
Facebook, Rich Crowder. So yeah, just I think I pop up pretty high on the Google search.
Yeah.
So.
RICHCROWDER, like the chowder.
Correct.
Awesome. That's it. That's all I have to share for today. And unless there was any final lasting words you wanted to impart.
Thanks for having me.
Again, I appreciate
This was fun.
you, man. Thank you.
Yeah.